The night Yash Ashwalker crept onto Oliver Slater's porch and carved symbols into his door with a blade no wider than her thumb. She had not yet decided whether she wanted him to understand what she had written, or whether she simply needed to leave something true in the world before she disappeared from it entirely. She pressed the tip of her short iron blade into the old pine wood and worked by the light of a dying moon, her green-skinned fingers steady despite the cold that had settled over the Redthorn Valley like a lid over a pot. She was not a small woman, orc women rarely were, but she was lean in the way that long winters and longer roads make a person lean, her figure curved and strong beneath a close-fitted leather bodice, laced up the front with rawhide cord, over a worn but sturdy linen blouse that hugged her shoulders and tucked into dark travel leggings. The whole of it layered under a patched fur-lined vest. She had traded a wolf pelt for outside duskmill the previous autumn. Her dark hair was pulled back in a rough braid that had come half undone, and one of her lower tusks bore a small copper ring that caught the moonlight when she turned her head. She was 23 years old and she had not slept in 2 days. The symbols she carved were older than the valley, older than the town that had grown up around the trading post, older than the war that had made humans and orcs into enemies, and then into grudging, uneasy neighbors. They were the runes of the Ashwalker clan, a clan that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, scattered after the Battle of the Greywash 8 years ago. She pressed each line into the wood not because she expected Oliver Slater, bachelor homesteader of the Redthorn Valley, to read them, but because she needed them to exist somewhere other than her own chest. What she carved was a protection mark, a ward for the dwelling of a person who had, without any reason she could yet understand, shown her kindness. She had arrived in the valley 4 days ago, half-starved and soaking wet from 3 days of rain, leading a lame horse she had borrowed from a man who was probably not going to offer that borrowing generously once he sobered up. She had come through the East Pass, which was technically closed to orc travelers by the Redthorn Charter, and she had known it and done it anyway because the alternative was to go around by the South Fork Road, which took 2 extra weeks, and she did not have 2 extra weeks. She had a destination and a reason, and both of them were running out of time. Oliver Slater's homestead was the first property past the tree line. It sat in a clearing of frost-stubbled grass with a barn, a root cellar, and a modest log house with smoke coming from the chimney. She had not intended to stop there. She had intended to walk past it and into town and conduct her business and leave. She had made it approximately 40 feet past his fence before her lame horse sat down in the mud and refused to rise, and she sat down with it because her legs had given their notice. He found her sitting in the mud in the rain next to a horse that had decided it was done, and he stood in his doorway for a long moment, a tall man, broad through the shoulders, maybe 27 years old, with dark brown hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and a lantern held out at arm's length as though he were trying to read her at a distance. And then he walked out into the mud without a coat and said, with what she would later recognize as characteristic bluntness, "That horse needs a hot mash and a dry stall, so do you, by the look of it, come on." She had stared at him with open suspicion, because that was the reasonable response when a human man walked out of a house in the dark and offered you hospitality. In her experience, hospitality from human strangers came with costs that were not stated at the front of the transaction. But he had not looked at her the way that men in border towns looked at orc women, like something between a threat and a curiosity. He had looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he intends to solve. She helped him get the horse up. He did not flinch when her hand closed over the rope he was holding and their knuckles brushed in the dark. He talked to the horse. He knew what he was doing with horses, she noticed. She followed him into the barn and stood in the dry warmth while he bedded the animal down with grain and straw and checked the lame leg with practiced hands, narrating his findings in a low, matter-of-fact voice as though she had asked, which she had not. "Soft tissue, not the bone," he said. "She needs 3 days rest minimum, maybe 5. I cannot stay 5 days, Yash said. Her voice was lower than most humans expected from her, and precise in the way that second-language speakers are precise, each word chosen and placed. I need to reach town. What do you need in town? That is my business. He had looked at her over the horse's back with dark, steady eyes and said, "Fair enough," and that was the end of it. He gave her a bowl of stewed venison and a place by the fire and a blanket, and he asked her name and gave her his, and then he went to bed and left her to it. He did not lock his door. He did not take her blade. He did not ask her to sleep in the barn. These were not small things. She had lain by his fire on the floor, wrapped in his blanket, and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of Oliver Slater, and eventually she slept, which she had not been doing easily for a while. The next day she went into town alone. He gave her directions and offered his second horse, and said she could leave whenever she liked. She took the horse and the directions, and rode into Redthorn at mid-morning, and she felt the eyes before she saw the people, that particular kind of attention that comes from a settlement where orc visitors were unusual enough to be treated as events. She was watched from doorways and storefronts with expressions ranging from flat hostility to nervous curiosity. A man outside the cooperage spat in the direction of the road when she passed. A woman pulled her children inside a door that had been open. Yash kept her spine straight and her eyes forward and rode to the magistrate's office, which was what she had come for. The thing she had come to Redthorn for was a deed. Her uncle, Yash Ashwalker, had been the last elder of their scattered clan, and he had died in the late autumn holding a piece of paper he had never been able to convert into anything real. A deed to 40 acres at the north edge of the valley, purchased from the previous land agent 30 years ago when the law had briefly allowed orc landholding in the territory. When Drac died, he had left that deed to Yash, because she was the last one. The deed was a technicality, a relic, almost certainly going to be contested, but it was hers, and she had come to find out whether the law of the valley was going to honor it or whether she was going to have to make other plans. The magistrate, a round-faced man named Geddon who had the look of someone who had spent many years doing moderately dishonest things in a paperwork-shaped way, looked at the deed for a long time and then looked at Yash and said that there were certain complications with orc landholding claims under the current charter, and that she would need to file a contestation and come back in no fewer than 30 days for a hearing. She said that was fine. He said that in the meantime she could not occupy or work the land. She said she understood. He said that he was obligated to inform her that there were parties who might be interested in purchasing the claim. She said she was not selling. He looked at her with the flat, measuring gaze of a man who expected to win, and said that she should know the hearing process could be quite costly. She said she would manage. She rode back to Oliver Slater's homestead because her horse was still there, and she had nowhere else to be for 30 days. He was splitting wood in the yard when she returned. He was not a man who wasted time. He looked up when she rode in and said nothing, just went back to splitting, and she unsaddled the horse and put it in the pasture and went to sit on the fence. After a while he came and leaned on the fence beside her, axe handle resting on his shoulder, and said, "Did you get what you needed?" "I got a delay," she said, 30 days before a hearing. "On what?" She told him about the deed. She was not sure why she told him. It was perhaps because he was the first person in 4 days who had spoken to her without some version of hostility or commerce, and the telling of it had been sitting in her chest without anywhere to go. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had noticed about him. He listened fully, not the kind of listening that is really just waiting to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the far tree line, and then he said, 40 acres at the north end. That's the old Graybell parcel. Good land, clay soil, but it holds water. You know it. My father looked at buying it once, decided it was too far from the river." She looked at him. He looked at the trees. Then he said, "You should stay here while you wait, for the 30 days. Your horse needs the rest anyway." She opened her mouth to refuse, because refusing was the sensible thing, the safe thing. the thing you did when you did not yet know what a kindness was going to cost. He looked at her then, and his expression was not pity and it was not strategy. It was just the same direct, problem-solving look he had turned on the lame horse in the mud. "I have a spare room," he said. "It's not much. I could use a hand with the plowing if you're willing. The south field needs to be turned before the freeze comes back." Fair trade. She said she would think about it. She stayed. The first week was careful. She slept in the spare room, which was small and cold and smelled of cedar and old leather, and she worked the south field with him, and they spoke in practical sentences about practical things. She learned the rhythms of his farm. He rose before dawn and did not speak much until he had eaten. He was methodical with his tools, cleaning them at the end of each day, hanging them in their proper places in the barn. He cooked adequately, which she noted as an improvement on many men she had known, and he made his coffee strong. She cooked for them on the third day because she was a better cook, and it was inefficient not to take the better option. She made a broth with dried venison and late-season root vegetables from his cellar and some dried herbs she had in her pack, ash sage and bitter root, orc flavoring that was strange to a human palate. She put the bowls on the table and sat down without explanation. He took a spoon and tasted it and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is the herb, the sharp one?" "Ash sage. It grows on north-facing slopes. My grandmother used it in everything." "It's good," he said, and ate the whole bowl. Small things, but she catalogued them. The way he did not flinch from her. The way he noticed things and said so plainly. The way he did not ask her to be smaller. The second week the weather turned vicious. A hard northern wind that brought 3 inches of snow and split 2 of his fence posts. They spent a day in the barn doing repairs, and she showed him the way her people braced posts against frost heave, packing the base with gravel and clay in a particular order. He watched her demonstrate it once, and then did it himself, correctly, the first time. She found she liked working beside someone who was competent. It was a rarer quality than it should have been. That evening they sat by the fire after dinner, and she asked him why he had not asked her to leave the first night. He turned his coffee mug in his hands and thought about it honestly. "You sat down in the mud," he said. "Not to be dramatic, not to beg, you just ran out. And you sat down next to that horse like you were going to sit there with it whatever happened. I don't know. It seemed like you deserved a fire." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow was coming down thick and white beyond the window. "Most men in this valley would not say that," she said. "Most men in this valley haven't thought about it hard enough," he said, without particular pride, just as a fact. She went to her room that night and lay in the dark thinking about him, which was a new development. It was at the end of the second week that she crept to his door in the dead of night with her blade and carved the mark. She did it in 3 careful minutes, the protection rune of the Ashwalker clan, pressed into the old pine with precise, practiced strokes. Then she stepped back and looked at it and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. She went back to bed. He found it in the morning. She was at the stove making porridge when she heard him stop on the porch. There was a long silence. Then he came back inside with an expression she could not quite read, not alarm, not offense, something closer to wonder. "There are marks on my door," he said. She turned from the stove. "Yes." "Did you put them there?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "What do they mean?" She stirred the porridge. She was quiet for long enough that he probably thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "Will you show me which marks you saw so I can be certain which ones are there?" He went to the door and stood beside it, and she came to look. She had carved it well even in the dark. The lines were clean, the curves precise. She traced them with her fingertip without touching the wood, going through each element in her mind. "This outer ring," she said, "is a boundary mark. It tells any being who can read the old script that this dwelling is under the protection of someone who has made a pledge." He watched her face. "A pledge to who?" "To the dwelling, to the person inside it." She dropped her hand. The porridge needed attending. She went back to the stove. In the old clan way, when a warrior traveled and was given shelter by someone worthy, they would mark the door on the last night of their stay. It told any other of their kind, "Do not harm this house. Do not harm these people. They are under the word of the one who marked this. He came back inside. He pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, watching her. So you marked my door, he said slowly. You gave me shelter and work and a bowl of your food, she said. In my people's tradition, that earns a mark. It is not a small thing. I didn't know that. No, she said. You did it anyway. She put his porridge in front of him and sat down across from him with her own bowl, and he was quiet, which she now knew meant he was thinking, and she let him think. After a moment he said, "Can I ask you what the other marks say? The ones inside the outer ring." She met his eyes. "They are personal to the one being marked. I would rather not say all of them." He nodded. He picked up his spoon. "All right," he said, and ate his porridge and did not push, and she found that her heart was doing something irregular and inconvenient in her chest. The third week began. She rode into town twice more to check on the status of the contestation filing. The magistrate, Gedden, informed her each time that there were additional documents being requested and that the process was proceeding at its normal pace. She sat in the hard chair across from his desk and said the same thing she had said the last time, that she was not selling, that she was waiting, that she would return. On the second visit, she noticed that the man sitting in the corner of the magistrate's office was not a clerk. He was too well dressed for a clerk, and he watched her with too much interest. When she left, she made a note of it. She told Oliver about the man in the corner that evening over dinner. Oliver put down his fork and said, "Describe him." She described him: heavy through the jaw, silver buttons on his coat, a ring on his right hand that was set with something dark red. Oliver's jaw tightened. "That sounds like Cord Haverson." "Who is Cord Haverson?" "He's the man who bought most of the valley north of the creek in the last 6 years. He's been trying to get the Graybell parcel for 2 of those years." He picked his fork back up but held it without eating. "He's the reason the Charter's land restriction clause on Orc holdings has been enforced more strictly in the last few years. He pays to have that enforced." She looked at her hands. "So the hearing will not be fair." "Probably not." He ate a bite of food and chewed and swallowed. "That doesn't mean you can't win it. It means you need to walk in with something solid." "What is solid in a place where the magistrate is paid to look the other way?" "Witnesses," he said. "People from the valley who knew the original sale was legitimate. Your uncle, did he have any documents besides the deed? Correspondence, receipts, a survey record?" She had a survey record. She had not mentioned it because she had not thought it relevant, but she went to her room and retrieved it from the bottom of her pack, a folded paper, dirty and soft at the creases, bearing the seal of the original land agent, dated 31 years ago. A formal survey of the Graybell parcel with her uncle's name written in the land agent's hand. She brought it to Oliver and spread it on the table. He read it carefully, running his finger along the lines of text, and then he looked up. "This is solid," he said. "This is very solid. Gedden can slow down the contestation all he wants, but with this and the deed together, he cannot legally refuse to recognize the claim. Not with the original agent's seal." "Haverson will find another way," she said. "Probably," Oliver agreed, "which means you need to be ready to make noise, public noise, the kind that's harder to buy off." He was quiet for a moment. "I can speak at the hearing as a character witness, as someone who knows the land and the history." She stared at him. "You would do that?" "Of course I would." "Oliver," she said his name carefully, holding it. "If you speak for an Orc woman's land claim in this valley, Haverson will make your life difficult." "Then he'll make it difficult," Oliver said, with a mildness that she recognized was not indifference but something more like bedrock. "I grew up on this homestead. My father built that barn. Haverson's money doesn't run deep enough to buy the ground I'm standing on, and he knows it. He won't come for me directly." He folded the survey record gently and slid it back to her side of the table. "You keep that safe. Put it somewhere he can't get to it before the hearing." She folded it and pressed it back into the inner pocket of her vest against her ribs. "Thank you," she said. The words felt insufficient. She said them anyway. He smiled at her, a quiet, private smile that reached his eyes. "That's what the mark on the door was for," he said. "Right. Somebody should be watching out for this house." Her heart did the inconvenient thing again. The third week moved into the fourth, and the shape of the days between them shifted in the way that the shape of a thing shifts when it is growing, not dramatic, not announced, but real. She noticed everything: the calluses on his hands, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward when he was concentrating on something, the sound of him moving around the house in the morning before she woke, the creak of the floorboard outside the kitchen, the particular way he set the kettle down. The fact that he had, without discussion, begun to take the heavier end of every shared load, not to spare her, but because he was taller and the angle worked better. She noticed the morning she woke before him, and went out to the barn to check on the horses, and came back inside to find him standing in the kitchen with sleep-tangled hair and one sock, holding the kettle, and looking at the hearth with the blank expression of a man who has not yet fully rejoined the living, and she felt something catch warmly in her chest like the first hold of a good fire. She said, "Good morning." He said it back, still without full focus, and then he squinted at her and said, "Did you already feed them?" "Yes, you didn't have to do that. I know." He made a sound that was not quite a word and went about making coffee, and she went to make her own preparations for the day, and neither of them said anything about what it meant that she had just gone and done a thing because it made the morning easier for him. On the 21st day of her stay, an event occurred in town that changed the texture of things considerably. She had ridden into Redthorn for her third meeting with the magistrate, and she had come out of the office to find that 4 men had gathered around her horse at the hitching post, not in the casual way of passers-by, but in the deliberate way of men who have arranged themselves. 2 of them she had seen around town in the way you see certain faces more than is coincidental. One of them had a bruiser's build, and the flat eyes of a man who does things for wages rather than reasons. The fourth was Cord Haverson, in his silver buttons, looking at her from the boardwalk with his hands in his pockets. He said, in a pleasant enough voice, that he understood she was staying at the Slater homestead, and that he wanted her to know there was a standing offer for the Graybell claim that was quite generous, and that it would be a shame if the hearing resulted in the claim being dismissed on a technicality, and that he had noticed she had been using the East Pass, which was a charter violation that the constable had some discretion over. She stood in the open street with the whole of the morning's foot traffic moving around them, the smells of the market stalls, and the sound of a horse being reshoed around the corner, and she looked at Haverson and said, clearly and at a carrying volume, "You are threatening me with a charter violation that you have been lobbying to create, in order to seize land that was legally purchased 31 years ago. Is that an accurate description of this conversation?" Several people on the boardwalk stopped moving. Haverson's expression went very still and precise. "I'm having a civil conversation," he said. "Then have it with the magistrate," she said, "because I will be at the hearing with my deed and my survey record, and I will be interested to see how a magistrate explains to a public audience why a sealed document from his own office's records is insufficient to confirm a legal claim." She untied her horse and mounted, which brought her eyes level with Haverson's, and she looked at him for a moment from that height with the specific steadiness of a woman who has survived harder men than this one, and then she rode. Her hands were not entirely steady until she was out of town, but she had said it out loud in the street with people listening. That was the point. She told Oliver what had happened when she returned. He listened standing up, which was unusual for him. He usually settled into something when she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He wasn't supposed to move openly like that. He's rattled. Or he thought it would work and it didn't, and now he is adjusting," she said. "Either way, it means the hearing date matters. We need to make sure it happens before he can have it moved or dismissed." He was already pulling his coat off the peg. "I'm going to talk to Fenn." "Who is Fenn?" "Old surveyor, retired. He was working this valley when the Graybell parcel was originally sold." If Haverson calls the survey record into question, Fenn can confirm the original agent's seal is authentic. He had his coat on. "He lives up the valley. I'll be back before dark." He was back before dark. Fenn, he reported, remembered the sale clearly, had confirmed the original agent's seal, and had, with some satisfaction, because he did not like Haverson, not at all, as it happened, agreed to appear at the hearing if needed. That night they sat on the porch after dinner in the cold, wrapped in separate blankets, looking out at the frost-white field and the darkness of the tree line beyond. The stars were very clear. Her breath made white clouds in the air. "You rode up the valley for me," she said, "for my claim." "I rode up the valley for what's right," he said, then after a pause, "and for you." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars, his profile calm and familiar to her now in a way she had not expected to let a person's face become familiar so quickly. He turned, felt her looking, and their eyes met in the cold darkness. She said, "Oliver." He said, "Yash." Neither of them said anything further for a moment. Then she reached across and put her hand on his hand where it rested on his knee, just laid it there over his knuckles, and he turned his hand over slowly so her palm was resting in his, and they sat like that in the cold and the dark and the extraordinary quiet of the valley at night, holding on to each other in the simplest possible way, until the cold drove them inside. She lay in her bed in the cedar-smelling dark and pressed her hand against her chest where her heart was making noise, and she thought about what it would mean to let this be what it felt like, and she decided that she was going to let it. 2 days before the hearing, Haverson made his second move. She was coming back from the root cellar when she heard the horses, 3 of them, on the road, turning into the property. She stood in the yard with an armful of turnips and watched them come. The bruiser from outside the magistrate's office was one of them. The second was a man she did not know. The third was the constable of Redthorn, a lean, weather-worn man named Priddle, who had the look of someone who had long since made peace with being a tool in other people's hands. Oliver came out of the barn with a look that said he had heard them coming. Constable Priddle rode up to the edge of the yard and said, in the way of a man reciting a legal document he finds personally distasteful, that he had received a formal report of an orc traveler in violation of the East Pass Charter restrictions, and that he was obligated to inform the individual in question that they were subject to a 5-day detention at the territory post while the matter was reviewed, which would, of course, extend beyond the date of the hearing. He looked at Yash as he said it. Then he looked at Oliver, then back at the road. Oliver walked out of the yard and stood in the road between the horses and the porch. He stood there in his work clothes with the morning light behind him and his hands loose at his sides, and he said, without raising his voice, "The East Pass restriction applies to orc travelers conducting trade without a charter permit. Yash Ashwalker came through the East Pass to file a land claim under the Greybell deed. That's a legal proceeding, not trade. The restriction does not apply." Priddle looked at him. "The distinction may not hold up." "Then let it not hold up in the hearing room in front of everyone on the day the hearing happens," Oliver said. "Not out here, 2 days before." He looked at Constable Priddle with a clarity that had something hard at its center, not aggressive, but immovable. "You've been the law in this valley for 16 years, Constable. You knew my father. You know what this property is, and you know what that deed is. You can enforce this citation and have whatever conversation you need to have with Haverson afterward, or you can let it go and sleep the same way you always have." The constable sat on his horse for a long moment, the kind of moment in which a man weighs things that cannot be put on a scale. Then he said, to his horse's ears, "I don't find sufficient grounds for the citation at this time." He looked at his 2 companions. "We're done here." He turned his horse. The bruiser and the unknown man exchanged a look and followed. They rode back down to the road and away. Yash stood in the yard with her arms full of turnips and watched them go. Then she looked at Oliver, who had come back inside the fence and was watching the road as though he wanted to make sure they kept going. "You know the law that well," she said. "I know that law specifically," he said. "I looked it up last week, at the record office in town." He turned to her. His expression was very direct. "I told you I was going to make noise. The noise works better if you know which exact points to make it on." She stood in the cold with the turnips and looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Oliver Slater. Yes, you are a remarkable man. He looked at the ground with the slightly cornered expression of a person who is not accustomed to being told remarkable things and does not entirely know what to do with the word. Then he looked back at her. I'm just a farmer, he said. No, she said clearly and carried the turnips inside. The night before the hearing she could not sleep. She lay in the small cedar room and listened to the house settle and the wind move against the roof, and she felt the weight of the next day pressing on her. 40 acres. Her uncle's name on a piece of paper. The last thing the Ashwalker clan owned in the world. She pressed her hand flat against the survey record inside its folded cloth and thought of Drac, who had been old and worn and who had died still believing that law could be a place where the right thing happened if you pushed hard enough. She was not as sure of it as he had been, but she was here and she would push. A soft knock at her door. Yash, Oliver's voice low, are you awake? Yes. I made tea. She pulled on her vest over her blouse and went out. The main room was warm, the fire down to coals, the lantern turned low. He was sitting at the table with 2 mugs. She sat across from him and wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. You're not sleeping either, she said. I sleep fine, he said. I made tea. She looked at him. He met her eyes and after a second the corner of his mouth turned. All right, he said. I'm not sleeping either. What are you thinking about? He turned his mug. The things that could go wrong tomorrow, and then what we do about each of them. I've been through the list a few times. What is at the end of the list? We've covered all of them, he said without drama. Fen is there. The documents are solid. I'll speak. You'll speak. The magistrate can stall and squirm, but he cannot legally dismiss a claim with this paper trail in public. If Haverson tries anything overt, there will be witnesses. He looked at her over his mug. You're going to win tomorrow. You don't know that. No, he agreed, but I believe it. She looked at him in the low lamplight, this man with the dark hair and the steady hands and the inexhaustible willingness to simply do the right thing without any performance of it. And she felt such a specific, particular tenderness that it was almost more than she knew what to do with. She said, Oliver, I want to tell you what the marks on your door say. He was very still. All of them, she said. Not just the outer ring. He put his mug down and gave her his whole attention. She said, the outer ring, as I told you, is the protection ward, the boundary of the pledge. She traced a shape in the air between them with her finger. Inside the ring on the left is the glyph for steady water. It is what we say for someone who is calm and deep and consistent, someone who does not change with the weather. He was quiet. On the right is the glyph for given fire, she said. That is for generosity. Not the giving of things, but the giving of warmth. There is a difference in the script. The fire crackled. In the center, she said and paused. In the center is a mark I have never carved for anyone before. It is not a standard ward. What is it? He asked very softly. It is the mark we call the root word, she said. In the old tradition, it means this person is where I am planted, where I stay. She met his eyes and held them. It means that I put down a root here. It means that you are the reason I am still standing up. The fire made a small sound. The wind moved over the roof. Oliver reached across the table and put his hand over hers, both hands, cupping her hand between his palms and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. She turned her hand over and held his. After a long time, he said, I have been trying to find a way to say something to you for the last 10 days and I have not found the right words. I am not as good with words as you are. Say it plainly, she said. I prefer plain. I don't want you to leave, he said. After the hearing, whether you win or lose, I don't want you to go. I don't know what to call that yet, but I wanted you to know. She looked at him in the quiet lamplight of his kitchen, this frontier man who had walked out into the rain for her, who had looked up the law, who had stood in the road with his hands loose and his voice steady. And she said, I carved the root word on your door, Oliver. I think we know what to call it. He exhaled, slow and quiet. Then he leaned forward across the table and brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. His eyes closed, warm and deliberate, and she felt it through her whole hand and up her arm and into the center of her chest where the root word lived. She stayed at the table with him until the fire was entirely cold, and the sky outside the window began to think about being gray. And they talked, not about the hearing, not about Haverson or Fenn or the magistrate, but about other things, the real things. He told her about his father building the barn with 2 neighbors in a single week, the way the valley had been when he was young. She told him about the Ashwalker clan before the Greywash, the great fires they made at the autumn equinox, the way her grandmother's voice sounded when she sang the old naming songs. He told her about being 20 years old and deciding to stay on the homestead instead of going to the city, and never once regretting it. She told him about the road after the war, about the years of walking and the camps, and the slow business of learning to be a person who was not defined by loss. He listened to all of it in the way that he listened to everything, fully and without rushing, and at the end he said, "You've been alone for a long time." "Yes," she said. "So have I," he said. "I didn't mind it until I started minding it." She understood exactly what he meant. The morning came in gray and cold, the sky flat and low. They ate breakfast early and dressed warmly and rode into Redthorn together, side by side on the road, and the fact of that, the side-by-side of it, felt like something declared. The hearing was held in the common room of the magistrate's office, which was the only space in town large enough for it. It was more crowded than Yash had expected. Haverson had clearly expected to resolve this matter quietly, and the size of the audience, which included Fenn in his old surveyor's coat, 3 farmers who had come out of a combination of curiosity and principle, the woman who ran the trading post and who Yash had not met but who had clearly decided she had opinions, and a considerable portion of the morning's foot traffic was working against his preferred narrative. Geddon, the magistrate, looked at the room with the expression of a man whose plan has not gone how he wanted. Yash laid the deed and the survey record on the magistrate's desk. Oliver stood to her left, a half step back, not in front of her, not ahead of her, but there. Present, available. Geddon went through the procedural preamble in the manner of someone stalling. Haverson's representative, a lawyer from the city, imported for the occasion, in a coat that had never seen mud, made the opening argument that Orc landholding claims under the charter were subject to enhanced scrutiny, and that the provenance of the documents was unclear. Fenn, from the back of the room, said clearly, "I surveyed that parcel 31 years ago. I know that seal because I put it on the paper." The room shifted. The lawyer said that the survey record's age and condition made it suspect. Oliver said, "The condition of a document does not invalidate a legal seal authenticated by the surveyor who made it, while that surveyor is alive and present in this room and willing to testify." The room shifted again. Geddon looked at Haverson, who was standing against the wall with his silver buttons and his measured expression, and Haverson gave a very small, very controlled shake of his head, and Geddon looked back at the desk and said, in the slightly hollow voice of a man who has just recalculated his position, that he would need to review the documents more fully and that the hearing would recess for 1 hour. The hour was the longest Yash had sat through in recent memory. She sat on a bench outside in the cold, and Oliver sat beside her with their shoulders touching, and Fenn came and sat on her other side and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. The trading post woman brought coffee from somewhere and pressed a cup into Yash's hand and said, "Cord Haverson bought up my brother-in-law's land on a technicality 8 years ago. I hope you take his teeth today." When they went back in, Geddon recognized the claim, not warmly, not with any grace. He read the determination in the flat voice of a man swallowing something unpleasant, and his words were perfectly legal and utterly without ceremony, but the substance of them was clear. The Graybell parcel, 40 acres at the north of the valley, was recognized as belonging to Yash Ashwalker under the original purchase recorded 31 years prior, the deed and survey record both being verified and sufficient. She stood in the common room of the magistrate's office and heard it and felt the 40 acres settle into her, felt the weight of it. Her uncle's name and her clan's name, and her own name finally connected to a piece of ground that would hold still. She looked at Oliver. He was already looking at her. He was not smiling in a big way, but his eyes were warm and certain, and she felt that through the crowd and the noise and the cold drafts of the building, the same way she had felt his kiss on her knuckles, directly and completely. Outside afterward, in the bright cold air of the street, Fenn shook her hand with both of his old hands and said the valley had needed this. The trading post woman, whose name turned out to be Marta, kissed her cheek and said to come in for supplies whenever she needed and that she'd have a tab opened. The three farmers nodded with the particular compressed generosity of men who were not going to say a great deal but meant what they said. Haverson left without speaking to anyone. She watched him go and thought that he was not done, that men with money were rarely done after a single loss, but that today was not about him. Oliver stood beside her in the street and the crowd thinned around them and he said, 40 acres. 40 acres, she said. Good clay soil, he said. Holds water. So your father said. My father also said the north end of the valley was too far from the river, Oliver said. My father was sometimes wrong. He turned to look at her with the quiet directness she had come to love. It's about 3 miles from the homestead. I know. That's not far, he said. No, she said. It is not far at all. He held out his hand. She took it in the middle of the main street of Redthorn in front of the morning's remaining witnesses, and they walked to their horses that way, and she noticed Marta watching from the doorway of the trading post with an expression of considerable satisfaction. They rode back through the frost-bright morning with the sun beginning to work through the flat sky and the valley opening out before them, and she felt the land differently than she had felt it arriving, not as a place she was passing through, not as a place that was against her, but as a place that had a corner of itself that was hers. She thought about Drac. She thought about her grandmother's voice. She thought about the root word carved into Oliver's door. 3 miles was not far. The weeks that followed had a quality of settling, like new timber finding its shape. She began to ride to the north parcel in the afternoons to walk the land, to understand what was there, the clay soil Oliver had described, a small spring-fed hollow in the northeast corner that would water animals, the remains of an old stone wall along the west boundary that someone had started and never finished. She made notes on folded paper with a stub of charcoal and thought about what the land could hold. She slept at Oliver's homestead. Neither of them formally discussed this. She had her room. She had her place at the table and her side of the ongoing work and her mug on the shelf beside his mug, and the 30 days had passed, and her horse was long since sound, and none of that changed anything about where she slept. One evening she came back from the north parcel to find that he had pulled out his father's old survey tools from the back of the barn, a theodolite and a chain measure and some stakes, and laid them on the workbench in obvious preparation. I thought, he said when she appeared in the barn doorway, that the property lines should be properly marked before you begin building anything. The old stakes won't be reliable. She looked at the tools. You know how to use those. My father taught me. Enough for a basic survey. He looked at her. We could ride up Saturday and do the corners. They rode up Saturday and did the corners, working through the morning in the cold with the chain and the stakes, and she held the far end of the chain and called back measurements, and he drove the stakes with a wooden mallet, and by midday they had marked all 4 corners and the line of the old stone wall. They ate lunch sitting on the wall, bread and hard cheese from his pack, and looked out over the 40 acres with the kind of silence between them that is not empty. The spring hollow could support a small herd, she said, thinking aloud. 6 or 8 cattle, he agreed, maybe more in a wet year if you dug it out a bit, shaped it. I would need lumber, she said, for a shelter, something basic. I have timber on the south end of my land, he said. I've been meaning to clear it for the past 2 years. If you want to trade the labor, we could run the logs up here. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the hollow with the forward weight of concentration she had come to know. You want to help me build on this land, she said. He looked at her. Yes. Oliver, she said with great precision. Are you doing this because you want me to stay in the valley? A pause. Yes, he said. That is a significant part of it. Does that change anything for you? She looked at her piece of bread. She thought about the root word. She thought about 3 miles not being far. No, she said. It does not change anything. He reached over and put his arm around her shoulders there on the old stone wall in the cold winter light with 40 acres of clay soil and a spring hollow in front of them. And she leaned into him and felt the solid warmth of him and thought that this was what it was to be planted somewhere. The kissing, when it came, arrived without ceremony, which was right for both of them. It was after supper on a Wednesday, which was an ordinary evening in all other respects. They had been sitting by the fire, and she had been showing him more of the orc script. She had been teaching him, gradually and voluntarily, a few of the common glyphs, because he had asked with such genuine interest, and she found she liked watching him practice them with the focused expression he wore when he was learning something. And they were bent over a page he had been marking on, heads close together in the firelight. And he said something quietly about the curve of the glyph for water, and she turned to respond, and their faces were very close together in the warm light, and she stopped speaking mid-sentence. He looked at her. She looked at him. The pause lasted exactly long enough for the thing that was going to happen to make itself known to both of them. He kissed her gently, a careful and deliberate thing, and she kissed him back, and it was warm and unhurried and tasted of the apple tea they had been drinking. And when they broke apart, they were both very still for a moment. He said, "I've been thinking about doing that for about 3 weeks." She said, "I know." He looked at her. "You knew." "You are not difficult to read," she said. Though this was not entirely true, he had surprised her many times. She said it because she wanted him to know she had been thinking about it too, just as long. He kissed her again, less carefully and more certainly, and she put her hand on his jaw and let herself be kissed like someone who intends to stay, and the fire burned down around them in a perfectly ordinary and extraordinary Wednesday. The work of that winter was the clearing of the south timber on Oliver's land, which they did together through the short cold days, working from first light until the light gave out. It was hard, satisfying work, the kind that makes the body clear and the mind quiet. She was strong and experienced with an axe, which he had noted early and appreciated, not in the way that men sometimes noted a woman's physical capability with a quality of surprise that was itself diminishing, but as one competent person recognizes another. They worked well together in that way that becomes visible after enough time, anticipating each other's movements, reading each other's energy, knowing when to push and when to stop. The logs went up to her north parcel, by wagon in loads, across a 3-week stretch. He taught her a joinery technique from his father's method that he said was better for clay soil movement, and she showed him how the Ashwalker clan packed foundation stones to resist frost heave, which was a technique better than anything he had used before. The structure they raised between them was modest, a single-room shelter to start, solidly built, with a stone hearth and a good roof line. They called it a start. Haverson made one more attempt. In February, a city lawyer sent her a letter challenging the deed's validity on a new set of grounds, a technicality about the original Land Agents Commission's status at the time of the sale. It was the kind of legal challenge designed to cost more to fight than the land was worth to a person without resources. Yash brought the letter to Marta at the trading post, who turned out to have a brother in the city who was a practicing attorney and who was, as Marta put it, extremely interested in this particular kind of case. The brother came up on the spring road, reviewed everything, filed the appropriate response with a precision that evidently caught the city lawyer off guard, and Haverson's challenge was dismissed in 3 weeks without requiring Yash to appear or spend anything beyond what Marta's brother charged, which was very little, because he was also, as Marta noted, invested in being useful to people Haverson had wronged. Yash went to Haverson's property one afternoon. She rode alone and tied her horse at his gate and walked up to his house and knocked on the door, and when a servant answered, she asked to speak to Haverson, and he came to his own door after a minute with the controlled expression of a man who was not going to give her the satisfaction of showing that he had not expected this. She said, "I want you to understand that the North Parcel claim is settled and will not be moved. I want you to also understand that I am aware of every legal mechanism you have used and might use in the future, and that I have resources and people prepared to respond to each of them. I am not asking you to like me or to welcome me in this valley. I am informing you that I am going to be here, and that it will be considerably less expensive for both of us if you simply proceed as though the Graybell parcel belongs to me, because it does." Haverson stood in his doorway and looked at her with the face of a man who is doing arithmetic. Then he said, "You're very direct for someone in your position." "My position," she said, "is on my own land, which tends to simplify things." She turned and walked back down to her horse and rode away, and she did not look back, and he did not follow. She told Oliver that evening. He sat with his coffee and listened, and then he laughed, a genuine, full laugh that she had not heard from him at full volume before, warm and real. "You rode to his house," he said. "He needed to know it was settled. You rode to his house alone. He is a man with money, not a soldier," she said. "He would not do anything foolish in front of his own household." Oliver shook his head, still laughing in a quiet, delighted way. "Yash Ashwalker. Yes. You are going to make the next 40 years of living in this valley very interesting." She looked at him across the table and felt the words settle around her. "The next 40 years," said as a simple fact, an assumption, a given, and she said, "I intend to." Spring came to the valley the way it always did, gradually and then all at once, the frost retreating and the mud succeeding it, and then the first green pushing up through the dark clay. She began turning the North Parcel's soil in earnest, and he helped on the days when his own fields could spare him, and gradually the 40 acres began to look like land that was being used. The relationship between them had its own season's progression. The warmth of winter evenings by the fire was joined by the warmth of spring mornings in the fields, and the physical ease of people who are comfortable with each other deepened into something more deliberate. She knew the feel of his hand in hers with the intimacy of something practiced. She knew the particular quality of his attention when he was watching her with something more than practical interest, a certain stillness, a slight adjustment of his angle toward her. He knew, she suspected, when she was troubled before she showed it openly, which was a strange and intimate knowledge to have given someone. One evening in early spring, when the light lasted long enough to be worth sitting outside for, they were on the porch together, and she had her head leaned against his shoulder and his arm was around her, and the valley was doing its spring thing of being gold and green and enormous, and she said, without planning to, "I have been trying to find the word in your language for what I feel about you." He was quiet, attentive. "In the old script," she said, "there is a word, tharok. It means something like the person who makes your breath mean something, that you breathe differently when they are near, that the air is different when they are in it." She paused. "I have been looking for your language's version." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not have an answer. Then he said, "I don't think my language has one word for it. I think it's the kind of thing we say in sentences." "What would the sentence be?" He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, a warm, unhurried thing. "You are the reason the homestead feels like a home," he said, against her hair. "That's the closest I can get." She lifted her head and looked at him, and he looked back at her with the full, steady weight of everything he was. And she thought that tharok was exactly right, every syllable of it. The night that followed was the particular kind of night that does not need to be explained so much as held. They had been a long time arriving at it, the slow accumulation of evenings, the shared work, the conversations that had gone as deep as she had gone with any person, the careful and tender buildup of trust between two people who had both been cautious for their own good reasons. When they finally moved together in the warm firelight of his house, it was not a beginning of something but a meeting place for all the things that had already been growing between them, with all the patience and tenderness that comes from a love that was earned in small daily moments, given fully without calculation, received in the same spirit. She felt known by him, and knowing, and she thought that this was perhaps the whole point of the root word, that you planted yourself not in the ground but in a person and grew from there. She woke before him in the morning and lay in the warm quiet and listened to the birds beginning and felt, with a completeness she had not felt in a long time, that she was somewhere she was meant to be. Summer was work and light and long evenings that belonged to them. She got her first cattle, 4 animals, purchased through Marta's network at a reasonable price, and ran them on the north parcel's hollow-watered pasture. She built a fence line with help from Oliver, and from one of the valley farmers who had attended the hearing, and whose name was Barr, and who turned out to be someone worth knowing. She planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of her shelter, and discovered that the clay soil, properly amended, grew root vegetables with a vigor that was almost aggressive. Oliver worked his own homestead with the same methodical efficiency she had come to love. They moved between the 2 properties, 3 miles, as he had said, not far, with the easy familiarity of people who have woven their days together without losing their separate shapes. She had her land. He had his. They had the road between and the evenings, and the work that sometimes overlapped, and the meals that were sometimes at his table and sometimes at hers. In the late summer, Marta organized a harvest gathering at the trading post, a community meal that was a tradition in the valley, held every year, and to which, Marta was very clear, Yash was invited. Yash went. She went with Oliver, arriving on the wagon in the early afternoon into the dusty yard of the trading post, where perhaps 40 people had gathered with food and blankets and children underfoot. She was aware of the attention. She had not stopped being aware of the attention. But it was different now. The attention of people who were deciding whether to know her, not the attention of people who had already decided against it. Barr introduced her to his wife, a practical woman with a loud laugh who asked immediate and blunt questions about her cattle management practices that were genuinely interested rather than interrogational. The old surveyor Fenn was there and greeted her warmly. 3 children who belonged to various farmers looked at her openly, with the honest curiosity of children who had not yet learned to convert curiosity into hostility. She helped carry food. She sat on a blanket in the late afternoon sun with Oliver's knee against hers and ate a plate of community harvest food and talked to Marta about root cellars. And at some point in the early evening she looked around at the gathering and felt, with careful and measured surprise, that she was somewhere she was not unwelcome. Not everywhere. There were still faces in town that looked away. There were still remarks sometimes in the market. The world did not transform because one season had been good. But the valley, or a part of it, the Barrs and Fenn and Marta, and the handful of others who had come to the hearing and decided to keep knowing her afterward, that part was something. Oliver, sitting beside her, turned and said quietly, "You're smiling." "Am I?" "A little, at the left corner." She did not stop smiling. Autumn came and deepened, and she made her first solo visit to the North Parcel to do the end-of-season work, spending 3 days in the modest shelter on her own land, managing her cattle and preparing the fields for winter. She came back to Oliver's homestead on the 4th day, and he had dinner waiting, and he said nothing about the fact that he had clearly been watching for her on the road, except that his relief when she rode in was visible to anyone paying attention. She unsaddled the horse and came inside and washed her hands and sat down at the table and looked at him making tea and felt, with the accumulated weight of a year of this, that the next conversation they needed to have was the one they had been building toward without quite naming. She said, "Oliver, I want to talk about what we are doing." He brought the tea to the table and sat down with the full attention quality she loved. "All right. I have my land," she said. "I have my cattle. I have a shelter that is livable, though not yet what it should be. I could make the North Parcel into a proper home and live there." She watched his face. It was very still. "Or I could build differently." He said carefully, "What do you mean differently?" "I mean that 3 miles is not far," she said, "but 0 miles is also a number." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you asking me to ask you to stay, or are you asking me to ask you something else?" She set down her mug. She reached across the table and took his hands in hers. His hands were large and warm and knew her by now, knew the press of her fingers and the roughness of her palms and all of it. "I carved the root word on your door," she said. "In the Ashwalker tradition, that mark is made by someone who intends to be a fixed presence in a person's life. It is not a temporary thing." "No," he said softly. "In the old way," she said, "a woman who carved the root word was, she chose the word carefully, declaring. That is the closest your language comes to it." He turned her hands over in his, slowly, looking at their joined hands rather than her face for a moment. Then he looked up. "In my tradition," he said, "the declaration goes the other way. The man asks." He paused. "So I'm going to ask." She waited. "Yash Ashwalker," he said, with the directness and the steadiness and the warmth that were him entirely, "will you marry me and stay in this valley and work this land and be in this house, and be with me for as long as there are winters to survive and fields to turn? Will you let me spend the rest of my life being someone worthy of having that mark on my door?" Her eyes were filling, which was not something she had expected or planned for, but she let it happen because he deserved to see it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He exhaled with the quality of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has just been told it is safe to put down. He brought her hands to his lips and kissed them both, and then he stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her close in the lamplight of his kitchen, and she pressed her face into the warm, solid place between his neck and shoulder, and felt the root hold. They were married in the spring. Marta organized it, because Marta was constitutionally incapable of not organizing things, and the result was a ceremony held in the field behind the trading post on a clear May morning with perhaps 30 people in attendance, including Barr and his wife and their 3 children, and old Fenn in his best coat, and a handful of others from the valley who had become something like community over the past year. There was no priest, because there was not one in the valley who would have performed the ceremony, but Fenn had some old authority as a charter witness, and he read from a document that Oliver and Yash had written together, combining the legal form of the territory's standard marriage record with language from the Orc pledging tradition that Yash provided. The resulting text was, she thought, considerably more honest and beautiful than either tradition would have produced alone. She wore her leather bodice and linen blouse, the same clothes she had arrived in cleaned and mended and fitted again with care, because they were what she was, and she was not going to be a different person on her wedding day than she was on any other. She had oiled the rawhide lacing until it was soft and dark, and she had retied her braid with a cord Oliver had given her the night before, a braid of thin copper wire that matched her tusk ring, which he had chosen because of the tusk ring, and which she thought was perhaps the most specifically observant gift she had ever received. He wore clean work clothes and his best vest, and had clearly wrestled his hair into order with some degree of effort and success. And when he looked at her across the distance of the field as she walked toward him, his expression was not the formal solemnity of a ceremony, but the open, certain warmth of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. The words they said to each other came from the document they had written, and they were plain and true. She said, "I mark this union with the Ashwalker root word, which I carved on your door before I knew how long I would stay, because some things are known before they are said. I give you my word, my work, my years, and the name that belongs to a clan that lives on in us." He said, "I give you this homestead and this valley and every day I have on this earth, and I will stand between you and whatever comes for you, and I will listen when you speak, and I will go into the mud with you when the horse sits down, because that is where the important things tend to happen." Marta was crying. The Barr children were chasing something in the grass at the edge of the field. Fenn looked at his document with the expression of a man who is keeping himself composed through sheer professionalism. Oliver kissed her in front of everyone, and she kissed him back, and behind them the valley was enormous and green and theirs. The years that built themselves on top of that morning had the texture of real-life work and weather and difficulty and joy, stacked up into something solid. They built the north parcel's small shelter into a proper farmhouse over the course of 2 years, room by room, as time and resources allowed, with Barr's help and their own labor. Oliver's homestead became the main working property for grain and hay, while the north parcel ran cattle, and eventually, a small flock of sheep that Yash introduced in the second year. The valley did not become uniformly welcoming. That was not how the world worked, and she had never expected it to. There were still stiff silences in certain corners of town and certain faces that would not quite turn toward her. But there was also Marta and Barr and Finn, and the growing number of people who had simply gotten used to her, which was its own kind of acceptance, she thought, less dramatic than transformation but more durable. She was present, and she kept being present, and over time the valley incorporated her the way soil incorporates what is planted in it, slowly and without particular ceremony. She and Oliver argued because they were both strong-willed people with clear opinions, and their arguments were direct and sometimes loud and always resolved, because they had each committed to a specific kind of honesty that made resolution possible even when it was uncomfortable. She had not realized before him that argument and security could coexist, that you could say the hard thing to someone and have that be safe rather than dangerous. In the third year of their marriage, she was pregnant, and the pregnancy was not easy in its early months, a difficult winter sickness that kept her close to the fire and made her furious with limitation. He did not try to minimize the difficulty or make it smaller than it was. He also did not make it a crisis. He brought her food she could stomach and kept the house warm and did the work of both properties without complaint and came and sat with her in the evenings with the particular steadiness that was his most fundamental gift to her. Their son was born in the early spring, a boy with her green complexion and his dark hair, and a small, decisive lower lip that seemed to belong to neither of them, and yet was completely himself from the first moment. She held him in the firelight of the bedroom, and Oliver sat on the edge of the bed with his forehead against hers, and neither of them spoke, because the moment had its own language that did not require translation. They named him Drac for her uncle. Oliver's middle name became his second, Drac Oliver Slater, who was born in the Redthorn Valley in the 4th year after the deed was recognized, in the house they had built together on land that had been paid for in years of persistence. He had her tusks, just barely, the earliest suggestion of them at the corners of his small mouth, and her green skin and his dark eyes, and he was the first half-orc child born in the valley, which was either a beginning or a first, and either way it was something. The summer he was born, Marta sent a letter to her city brother about a series of cases she had heard of orc families whose land claims had been contested and lost under the same charter provisions Haverson had tried against Yash. The brother took an interest. The interest became a legal challenge. The challenge worked its way through the territory courts over the following 2 years with Yash's deed and hearing records as a primary precedent, because the Redthorn case was unusually clean and well documented. The charter's land restriction clause was struck in the 5th year after the hearing. She heard about it by letter from Marta's brother, a brief and precise communication that nonetheless communicated, in its very precision, that he understood what it meant. She read the letter in the kitchen, and Oliver came in from the morning work and saw her face and said, "Good news." She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, and when he was done he looked at her with the warmth she had come to know as the deepest version of his expression, the one he reserved for things that were larger than ordinary gladness. "You did this," he said. "The law did this," she said. "I just gave it a specific case to follow." "You did this," he repeated simply, and put his arms around her, and she let him hold it that way because it was a day for that. She took Drac to the north parcel in the evenings when the weather was good, carrying him on her back in the carrier she had made from the Ashwalker pattern her grandmother had used, walking the fence lines and the clay fields and the spring hollow while the cattle moved quietly in the late light. She talked to him as she walked in both languages, interweaving them, teaching him from the beginning that he lived at the intersection of two things, and that both of them were real and his. She showed him the carved marks on the door of Oliver's house, the original marks she had made on that cold night in the first week, now weathered into the wood and part of the door's grain. She lifted him to see them and traced each one with his small finger, explaining in the careful words you use for small people. "This is the boundary ring," she said. "This is steady water. This is given fire." He put his hand flat over the center mark. "That one," she said, and paused and felt the fullness of it, "is the root word. It means this is where we grow. This is where we are planted." He pressed his palm against the wood and looked at her with his father's dark eyes in her own green face. And she thought that her uncle would have found this, all of it, the 40 acres and the house and the hearing and the law and this child's hand on this door. She thought Drac the elder would have found it worth the paper he had held for 30 years. Oliver came out of the barn and walked across the yard and saw them at the door and stopped. And his face did the thing it did when the happiness was too direct to process with any expression smaller than his whole face. He walked over and put his hand on her back and kissed her temple and looked at Drac, who looked back at him with the ancient and evaluating gaze of a small child who has not yet decided which adults are worth his time. "What are you teaching him?" Oliver said. "The alphabet," she said. "The important letters first." He looked at the door and the marks and back at her and said, "Root word." "Yes." He put his arm around her, there in the doorway that bore the marks she had made before she knew what she was starting, and she leaned into him as she always did, as she intended to do for every year that remained to them, and the valley stretched out behind them in the warm evening light. The 40 acres of clay soil, the cattle moving at the hollow, the spring green already beginning to turn summer gold, the whole of it theirs and real. The mark on the door had not faded. She had checked once in the first winter, wondering whether the weather would take it. It had not. Pine was a stubborn wood. The lines she had pressed into it in the dark of a desperate night had settled into the grain and stayed, and she thought sometimes that was the thing about the root word. It did not mean you were going anywhere. It meant you had gone deep enough that leaving was no longer the shape of anything you could do. She had carved it before she knew his name meant home to her. She had known before she said it. Some things were like that. She pressed her hand flat against the door beside her son's hand and felt the old wood, the carved lines, the solid present fact of where she was, and she thought, Here is exactly where I meant to be. Oliver's hand covered both of theirs, warm and certain, and the door held.